The Galactic Strategic Combat Academy had a 97% success rate in producing the finest military minds in known space. The remaining 3% were usually attributed to paperwork errors, cosmic radiation affecting brain cells, or the occasional student who tried to eat their training manual. What they never expected was for their success rate to be completely demolished by a species that hadn't even figured out faster-than-light travel yet. Commander Vexithoric stood before the Academy's Great Hall, his 6 eyes twitching in what could generously be called suppressed panic. The Quillarian's usually pristine feathers were ruffled in a way that suggested either deep contemplation or the early stages of a nervous breakdown. Behind him, the Academy's most prestigious instructors sat in uncomfortable silence, their various alien anatomies all somehow managing to convey the universal expression of, "Oh crap, what have we done?" But let's back up a bit, shall we? Because like most disasters of galactic proportions, this one started with what seemed like a perfectly reasonable prank. The Threxari species prided themselves on being the galaxy's premier strategists. For 3,000 years, they had dominated every wargame, tactical simulation, and strategic planning session across 47 star systems. Their brains, which looked suspiciously like oversized walnuts with tentacles, were perfectly designed for calculating probabilities, analyzing patterns, and creating battle plans so complex they required their own instruction manuals. So when Junior Instructor Cleftang suggested inviting a representative from that backward little planet called Earth as part of their cultural exchange initiative, the reaction was immediate and unanimous. Hilarious. Think about it. Cleftang had wheezed through his gill slits, his purple skin flushing with mirth. These humans still use projectile weapons. They haven't even mastered quantum mechanics properly. We could invite one of their so-called military experts and watch them fumble through our basic training exercises. The other students would get a wonderful lesson in the superiority of advanced tactical thinking. The Academy Council had approved the proposal in record time. After all, what could possibly go wrong with inviting a primitive species to observe their sophisticated training methods? Enter Tobias Crankshaw. Now, Tobias wasn't exactly what you'd call Earth's finest military mind. He was a 32-year-old former army sergeant who had spent most of his service career in logistics, which is military speak for counting things and making sure they don't disappear. His most notable achievement had been successfully organizing a supply depot in a way that made sense to absolutely no one except him. He had a peculiar talent for finding unconventional solutions to problems that didn't seem to need solving, and an even more peculiar talent for making those solutions work, despite violating every known principle of common sense. When the mysterious alien invitation arrived at Earth's newly formed Department of Xenological Affairs, Tobias happened to be the only person in the building. Everyone else was at lunch, attending a conference about proper protocols for first contact scenarios, or hiding in the bathroom, hoping someone else would deal with the glowing space letter. Tobias read the invitation, shrugged, and figured why not? Free trip to space, all expenses paid, and he'd been getting bored with his current job of cataloguing military surplus anyway. The Academy's reception committee had prepared elaborate welcoming ceremonies, complete with 17 different types of formal greetings in various alien languages, and a comprehensive orientation packet covering basic safety protocols, dormitory assignments, and a detailed explanation of why certain foods in the cafeteria were considered weapons of mass destruction. What they got instead was Tobias stepping out of the transport shuttle wearing cargo pants, a t-shirt that read, "I break for nobody," in faded letters, and carrying what appeared to be a small bag containing 2 sandwiches, a thermos of coffee, and a paperback book titled 101 Uses for Duct Tape. "G'day," Tobias announced cheerfully to the assembled committee of distinguished alien dignitaries. "I'm Tobias. Nice place you've got here. Bit fancy for my taste, but hey, different strokes for different tentacles, right?" The silence that followed was so profound it could probably be measured in light years. Commander Vex Thorax stepped forward, his ceremonial plumage rustling with barely contained confusion. "Welcome, honored delegate from Earth. I am Commander Vex's Thorax, and I—" "Commander V, what now? Mind if I just call you Vex? Easier on the tongue, you know." "So what's the plan? Do I get a room or am I sleeping in the shuttle? Either way's fine by me. I've slept in worse places." The reception committee exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey volumes of unspoken panic. This wasn't going according to any of their carefully prepared scenarios. The Academy itself was a marvel of engineering and bureaucratic precision. Spanning 3 artificial moons in a triangular formation, it housed over 50,000 of the galaxy's most promising tactical minds. Every corridor was labeled with alphanumeric codes that indicated section, subsection, purpose, clearance level, and probable danger rating. Every room had a specific function that was documented in triplicate and filed in the Central Administrative Archive. Every schedule was planned to the nanosecond, every meal calculated for optimal nutritional and cognitive enhancement, and every lesson designed to build upon the previous one in a carefully orchestrated symphony of intellectual development. Tobias took one look at his orientation packet, which was roughly the size of a phone book and contained detailed floor plans for all 3 moons, and promptly lost it somewhere between the shuttle bay and his assigned quarters. "Don't worry about it," he told his assigned guide, a nervous young Killeridian named Zeetpak. "I'll figure it out as I go. Always do. How hard can it be? It's just a school, right?" Zeetpak's tail feathers began molting from stress. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong with their perfect plan came during Tobias's first combat simulation. The exercise was called Tactical Response Alpha 7 and had been carefully designed to challenge even the most advanced students. The scenario involved a complex multi-front battle with 17 different variables, 32 potential outcomes, and required knowledge of advanced quantum probability calculations to solve properly. The average completion time for new students was 4 hours and 37 minutes. The record holder, a brilliant young Kraxarian named Thrisavel, had managed it in 3 hours and 12 minutes and was still considered a prodigy. Tobias finished it in 17 minutes. He didn't use quantum probability calculations. He didn't analyze the 17 variables. He didn't even seem to understand what the 32 potential outcomes were supposed to represent. Instead, he looked at the holographic battlefield for about 30 seconds, shrugged and said, "Right, so the bad guys are over there and we're over here. Seems like they've got the high ground, which is annoying. Tell you what, let's just ignore the main battle entirely and send a small team around the back to blow up their supply depot. Once they run out of ammo, they'll either surrender or come down to fight us on level ground. Either way, problem solved." The simulation computer, which had been programmed to account for every possible strategic approach developed over 3 millennia of galactic warfare, spent several minutes making noises that sounded suspiciously like electronic whimpering before finally admitting that yes, technically that would work. Instructor Grixtel, a veteran of 47 actual campaigns and holder of the Academy's Medal for Tactical Excellence, stared at the results display with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. But you didn't calculate the enemy response patterns. You ignored the terrain advantages. You didn't even consider the logistical implications. "Didn't need to," Tobias replied, helping himself to what he assumed was coffee from the nearest dispenser. The liquid that came out was bright purple and tasted like liquid mathematics, but it had caffeine, so he deemed it acceptable. "Look, if someone's shooting at you, either shoot back, move somewhere they can't shoot you, or make it so they can't shoot at all. Everything else is just fancy paperwork." Dido, the other students in the simulation chamber, a carefully selected group of the Academy's most promising tactical minds from 12 different species, stared at Tobias with expressions ranging from confusion to what might charitably be called existential horror. By the end of his first week, Tobias had inadvertently broken the Academy's training computer system 3 times, caused 2 instructors to request stress leave, and somehow improved the performance scores of every student in his group by an average of 37%. He did this without reading a single manual, attending any of the theoretical lectures, or demonstrating even the most basic understanding of the Academy's fundamental principles. Instead, he spent his time wandering around the facilities, chatting with anyone who looked bored, and offering helpful suggestions like, "Why don't you just try the other door?" and "Have you considered hitting it with something heavy?" The Academy's carefully structured learning environment began showing signs of what could only be described as complete systemic breakdown. Take, for example, the incident with advanced siege warfare theory. The class was studying the classical Battle of Vorthak Prime, a legendary engagement where the great General Thexmaron had achieved victory through a brilliant 17-phase assault plan that had taken his staff 4 months to develop, and was still studied as a masterpiece of strategic thinking. Tobias listened to the lecture for about 10 minutes, raised his hand and asked, "Why didn't they just wait for winter? I mean, if the defenders were relying on those geothermal power plants and winter on that planet last 2 years, couldn't they have just waited them out? Lot easier than building siege engines and calculating orbital bombardment patterns." Professor Quilnath, who had been teaching this particular course for 30 years, spent the next 45 minutes explaining the complex logistical, political, and strategic factors that made such an approach impossible. Tobias nodded politely and said, "Yeah, but did they actually try asking the defenders to surrender first? I mean, siege warfare's expensive. Maybe they could have worked out a deal." The class erupted into chaos as 3,000 years of military doctrine suddenly seemed a lot less certain than it had that morning. But the real turning point came during what the Academy called practical combat applications, essentially supervised war games where students could test their theoretical knowledge against each other. The exercise was designed as a standard planetary assault scenario. 2 teams of 12 students each, with Team Alpha defending a fortified position and Team Beta attempting to capture it. The defending team had superior weapons and fortifications. The attacking team had mobility and the element of surprise. Both teams had access to the same tactical database and communication systems. Tobias ended up on Team Beta, much to his teammates' initial dismay. After all, what could a primitive human contribute to a carefully planned military operation? The answer, as it turned out, was chaos. While Team Alpha spent the first hour of the exercise setting up defensive positions according to the Academy's standard fortification protocol, and Team Beta spent the same hour developing a multi-phase assault plan based on the Krellian doctrine of overwhelming force, Tobias wandered off to explore the training ground. He came back 20 minutes later with a grin and an announcement that made his team leader's antennae twitch with anxiety. "Good news, everyone. I found where they keep the maintenance tunnels for this place. Turns out there's a whole network of service corridors running under the fortifications. Also, the defensive team's communication system is running on the same frequency as the cafeteria's food ordering system. Funny coincidence that. Team Beta's leader, a methodical Centauri named Clixvor, tried to explain that using maintenance tunnels was against the spirit of the exercise, and interfering with communication systems was completely outside the scope of the training scenario. Tobias listened politely and then asked, "But is it against the rules?" After consulting the official exercise guidelines, all 473 pages of them, Clixvor had to admit that technically, no, it wasn't specifically prohibited. "Well then," Tobias said cheerfully, "problem solved. Jenkins, Clixvor, you keep doing the fancy battle plan thing. Seems like you're good at it. Meanwhile, I'll just pop down through the tunnels and have a chat with their command post. See if we can't work something out. What followed was perhaps the most one-sided military exercise in the Academy's history. While Team Alpha waited for the expected frontal assault and Team Beta prepared their carefully coordinated three-pronged attack, Tobias emerged from a service hatch directly inside Team Alpha's command bunker. "Afternoon!" he announced cheerfully to the startled defenders. "Lovely fortifications you've got here, very professional. Listen, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you might want to check your communication system. I think someone's been ordering a lot of fish and chips to your frequency." Indeed, Team Alpha's tactical communications had been completely overwhelmed by what appeared to be several hundred orders for various cafeteria meals, all placed simultaneously and all requesting delivery to the defensive positions. "Now," Tobias continued, settling into a chair and opening his thermos of coffee, "I don't suppose you'd be interested in discussing terms of surrender. I mean, we could still do this the hard way, but it seems like a lot of unnecessary running around and shooting. Plus, my team's got some very enthusiastic ideas about orbital bombardment patterns, and honestly, I'm not sure this training ground's insurance covers that level of property damage." Team Alpha surrendered in 12 minutes and 37 seconds. The exercise observers, who included some of the Academy's most senior instructors, spent the next 3 hours trying to figure out exactly what had happened and whether it technically counted as a victory. The computer systems, meanwhile, began displaying error messages in languages that hadn't been invented yet. Word of the service tunnel incident spread throughout the Academy faster than a rumor about free pizza in the dormitories. Within days, students from every class were approaching Tobias with questions that their instructors couldn't answer. "How did you know about the maintenance tunnels?" "Well, I got lost looking for the bathroom on my second day. Ended up wandering around down there for about an hour. Nice place, very clean. Met a lovely maintenance droid named Beep who gave me a complete tour." "But how did you know about the communication frequency overlap?" "Heard it when I was getting lunch. Some poor kid was trying to coordinate a defensive perimeter, and the kitchen kept interrupting to ask if he wanted fries with his order. Seemed like the sort of thing that might be useful to know." "But what if the enemy had been expecting an attack through the service tunnels? Then we'd have tried something else. Maybe the air vents, or just knocked on the front door and asked nicely. People don't expect politeness in warfare. Very underestimated tactical advantage, politeness." The Academy's instructors held emergency meetings. Then they held emergency meetings about their emergency meetings. Then they held emergency meetings about the effectiveness of holding so many emergency meetings. The problem, they realized, wasn't that Tobias was wrong. The problem was that he was right, and they had no idea why. Every tactical doctrine in their databases assumed that all participants would follow the same basic principles of strategic thinking. These principles had been developed over millennia by the greatest military minds in the galaxy, tested in countless conflicts and refined into a perfect system of logical decision-making. Tobias seemed to have never heard of any of these principles, and somehow his complete ignorance of proper tactical theory made him more effective than students who had spent years mastering it. Professor Yilthara, head of the Academy's Department of Strategic Studies, attempted to analyze Tobias's methods using the Academy's most advanced behavioral prediction algorithms. The results were problematic. According to the computer analysis, Tobias's tactical decisions had a 73% probability of being completely random, a 19% probability of being based on factors not included in the simulation parameters, and an 8% probability of being the result of what the computer diplomatically termed unknown variables. The computer also noted that despite this apparent randomness, Tobias's success rate was higher than any student in the Academy's recorded history. "It doesn't make sense," Professor Yilthara exclaimed during a faculty meeting that had been optimistically titled Understanding the Human Phenomenon, but had quickly devolved into what could more accurately be called collective academic panic. "His methods are completely inconsistent with established tactical theory. He ignores probability calculations. He doesn't analyze enemy response patterns. He makes critical decisions based on what he calls hunches and gut feelings, concepts that don't even exist in our strategic databases. Commander Vexthorak, whose stress molting had reached alarming levels, pecked irritably at his lectern. Have we considered the possibility that he's simply lucky? Lucky? Professor Grickstall's eye stalks twitched with indignation. You can't build a tactical system on luck. Luck is the enemy of proper planning. Luck is what happens when you don't have enough data. And yet, observed Dr. Fentelak from the Department of Xenopsychology, his methods continue to produce results that our best students can't match using conventional approaches. And the room fell into the kind of silence usually reserved for moments of profound philosophical crisis, or the discovery that the cafeteria had run out of that blue stuff everyone liked. Finally, Instructor Quilpeck raised one of his tentacles hesitantly. What if we asked him to teach a class? The suggestion was met with expressions of horror, fascination, and the sort of desperate curiosity that drives people to poke things they probably shouldn't poke. And teach a class? Commander Vexthorak's voice rose to a pitch that caused several nearby data tablets to crack. He doesn't know any of our methodologies. He can't even read our tactical notation system. Half the time I don't think he understands what exercise he's supposed to be participating in. Exactly, said Quilpeck. And he's still outperforming students who've mastered all of those things. Maybe that's the point. The Academy's first ever course in alternative strategic approaches was announced with a brief notice posted in the student common areas. The description read simply, Unconventional Problem-Solving Techniques. Instructor, T. Crankshaw, Human. Prerequisites, none. Warning, traditional strategic theory may not apply. 67 students signed up in the first hour. By the end of the week, there was a waiting list of over 300 names. Tobias's first lecture was scheduled for the Academy's largest auditorium, which could accommodate 800 students and had been designed with acoustics that would allow every participant to hear even the most subtle tactical discussions. What they got instead was Tobias wandering onto the stage, looking around at the packed auditorium with mild surprise and saying, "Blimey, that's a lot of you. Right then, I suppose you're here because you want to learn about military strategy or something. Fair enough. First question, how many of you have ever been in an actual fight?" About a dozen tentacles, claws, and various other appendages rose hesitantly. Right. And how many of you have been in a fight where the other guy wasn't following the same rules you were? The number dropped to 3. And how many of you have ever had to solve a problem when you didn't have all the information, couldn't ask for help, and your solution had to work the first time or people would get hurt? One tentacle remained raised. Tobias nodded approvingly. Excellent. What's your name, tentacle person? Slick Snara, sir. I'm from the thermal mines of Kextol. We had some industrial accidents. Perfect. Slick Snara here has already learned the most important lesson in real-world problem-solving. Sometimes you don't get to practice, sometimes you don't get to research the optimal solution, and sometimes the universe doesn't care about your carefully laid plans. Slick Snara, tell everyone what you did when things went wrong. Well, sir, when the main ventilation system failed and we were trapped underground with toxic gas levels rising, I didn't calculate the optimal evacuation route. I just grabbed everyone I could see and ran toward the nearest light source. And it worked. We got out through an emergency shaft that wasn't on any of the official maps. Exactly! Tobias beamed, as if Slick Snara had just solved the mysteries of the universe. You didn't have time to analyze 17 variables and calculate probability matrices. You made a decision based on incomplete information, trusted your instincts, and adapted when new opportunities presented themselves. That, ladies and gentlemen, and assorted other life forms, is what I like to call practical problem-solving. A Krellian student in the third row raised a foreclaw. But, sir, What if you're wrong? What if your instinct leads you into a worse situation? Then you deal with that problem when you get to it, Tobias replied cheerfully. Look, I'm not saying planning is bad. Planning's great. I love a good plan. But what happens when your enemy doesn't follow your plan? What happens when the universe throws you a curveball? What happens when your carefully calculated 17-phase assault strategy runs smack into Murphy's Law? Murphy's Law? Several students asked simultaneously. Ah, right, human thing. Murphy's Law states that anything that can go wrong will go wrong at the worst possible moment, and probably in a way you didn't anticipate. It's not scientific, it's not mathematically provable, and it's absolutely the most reliable principle in the universe. Professor Yilthara, who had been observing from the back of the auditorium, felt something that might have been either an academic revelation or a minor stroke. So, Tobias continued, instead of trying to plan for every possible contingency, which is impossible, by the way, because the universe has a very creative imagination when it comes to finding new ways to mess with you, how about we focus on developing the ability to think on our feet, adapt quickly, and find solutions that don't depend on everything going according to plan? A Centauri student raised her hand. How do we do that? Great question. First exercise. Everyone turn to the person next to you. One of you is going to describe a problem. Any problem, doesn't matter what kind. And the other person has to come up with a solution in 30 seconds or less. No research, no consulting databases, no asking for additional information, just whatever pops into your head first. Go! The auditorium erupted into chaos as 800 students began frantically discussing problems ranging from broken Starship engines to relationship issues to the persistent shortage of decent coffee in the dormitories. Professor Yilthara watched in fascination as students who had spent months learning to carefully analyze every variable in a tactical situation suddenly found themselves proposing solutions like, have you tried turning it off and on again? And what if you ask someone who's dealt with this before, and maybe the problem isn't what you think it is? Most surprisingly, a significant percentage of these snap decisions were actually quite good. Time! Tobias called out after exactly 30 seconds. Right. How many of you came up with solutions that might actually work? About half the room raised their hands. And how many of those solutions were things you learned from your textbooks? The number dropped to almost zero. Interesting, isn't it? Now, I'm not saying textbooks are useless. Textbooks are excellent for understanding principles, learning from other people's experiences, and making sure you don't repeat historical mistakes. But textbooks can't teach you how to handle situations that nobody's written about yet. A student from the Advanced Tactics program called out, "But how do you know if your solution will work if you haven't analyzed all the variables?" "You don't," Tobias replied matter-of-factly. "That's rather the point. Sometimes you have to make decisions without complete information. Sometimes you have to trust that you'll figure out the details as you go along. And sometimes the best solution is the one nobody expects, because it's so simple that no one thought to try it." He paused to take a sip from his thermos, which today contained something that looked like coffee but tasted suspiciously like liquid energy drink mixed with quantum physics. Here's the thing about warfare, or any kind of problem-solving really. Your opponent is also intelligent. They've also studied the same textbooks you have. They're also trying to predict what you're going to do. So if you do exactly what the textbooks say you should do, they're probably prepared for that. But if you do something completely unexpected, especially something that works despite being theoretically suboptimal, well, that's when interesting things happen. The Academy's communication systems began registering unusual levels of chatter as students discussed these ideas with their friends, their instructors, and occasionally with the maintenance droids, who turned out to be surprisingly good listeners. Word of Tobias's Alternative Strategic Approaches class began spreading beyond the Academy. Other institutions started requesting copies of his lectures, which proved problematic since Tobias didn't use lecture notes, PowerPoint presentations, or any kind of formal curriculum. His teaching method seemed to consist entirely of asking questions, telling stories, and occasionally challenging students to solve impossible problems in ridiculous amounts of time. The Interstellar Military Education Council dispatched a team of observers to evaluate these unconventional methodologies and determine whether they represented a legitimate educational approach or simply an entertaining form of academic chaos. The observers arrived expecting to witness a breakdown of proper academic standards. Instead, they found themselves watching students who had been struggling with traditional tactical concepts suddenly developing innovative solutions to problems that had stumped military planners for decades. "It doesn't follow any recognized pedagogical framework," reported Dr. Thex Allen, the Council's lead educational assessor. "His classes have no structured curriculum, no measurable learning objectives, and no standardized evaluation methods. By every metric we use to assess educational effectiveness, this should be a complete disaster." "And yet," prompted the Council's chairman, "and yet student performance has improved across every measurable category. Problem-solving speed is up 43%, creative solution generation has increased by 67%, and perhaps most significantly, students are demonstrating much higher levels of adaptability when faced with scenarios that don't match their training parameters." The chairman's scales rustled with what might have been confusion or possibly indigestion. "How is this possible?" "We're not entirely sure," Dr. Thex Allen admitted. "The human appears to be teaching students to think differently about problems rather than teaching them specific solutions. He encourages what he calls lateral thinking, approaching problems from unexpected angles rather than following established logical progressions." "That sounds dangerously close to randomness." "That's what we thought initially, but when we analyzed the decision-making patterns, we found something interesting. The students aren't making random choices. They're making intuitive choices based on pattern recognition, emotional assessment, and what the human calls gut feelings. These choices often lack rigorous logical justification, but they frequently prove to be more effective than decisions based on complete analytical processes." The Council spent several days debating whether gut feelings could be considered a legitimate component of military education. The debate ended when one of Tobias's students, a young Killeridian named Redefined, successfully resolved a real-world crisis situation that had stumped 3 teams of professional military advisors. The crisis involved a mining colony that had lost contact with their orbital supply station. Standard protocol called for dispatching a reconnaissance team to investigate potential hostile activity, followed by a full diplomatic and military assessment if necessary. The projected timeline for resolution was 2 to 3 weeks. Reetpak suggested sending a single ship with a very loud communication system to the supply station with instructions to broadcast, "Hello, is anyone there? We brought pizza." The supply station responded immediately. They had been dealing with a computer virus that had infected their communication array, making it impossible to send messages but still allowing them to receive broadcasts. They had been waiting for someone to make contact for 3 days and were getting quite worried about the missed supply deliveries. Total resolution time, 4 hours and 27 minutes. The Academy's administration found themselves facing what could only be described as an institutional identity crisis. For centuries, they had built their reputation on producing graduates who could apply sophisticated theoretical knowledge to complex tactical situations. Their entire educational framework was based on the premise that superior strategic thinking came from superior analytical capabilities. Now they had a human who couldn't perform basic probability calculations, teaching students to ignore analytical processes in favor of something called winging it. And these students were consistently outperforming their traditionally trained peers. The crisis deepened when other military academies began reporting similar phenomena. Wherever humans had been introduced into established tactical education programs, traditional performance metrics had started behaving in ways that defied explanation. The Krelian War College reported that their exchange student, a former human automotive mechanic named Dave, who had accidentally been included in a diplomatic cultural exchange program, had revolutionized their approach to starship maintenance by suggesting they listen to what the engines are trying to tell you. The Centauri Strategic Institute found that their human observer, a retired librarian named Margaret who had volunteered for the program because she was curious about alien books, had solved a complex logistical puzzle by organizing their supply chain using what she called the same system I use for managing overdue library books. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply disturbing to educational institutions across the galaxy. Humans seemed to possess an innate ability to find effective solutions to problems without using any of the analytical methods that formed the foundation of advanced civilization. Commander Vex Thorak convened what he hoped would be the final emergency faculty meeting of his career. The agenda was simple. Figure out what to do about the human situation before the Academy's accreditation committee arrived for their scheduled inspection. The problem, he announced to the assembled instructors, is that we can no longer determine what constitutes proper tactical education. Our human instructor produces results that exceed our best traditional methods, but he does so using approaches that contradict everything we understand about effective learning. Professor Yilthara, who had been taking extensive notes on Tobias's teaching methods, cleared her throat nervously. I believe I may have identified part of the issue. We've been assuming that effective tactical thinking requires comprehensive analytical processes, but humans seem to approach problems using what could be called integrated intuition. They synthesize information, experience, and environmental factors in ways that bypass conscious analysis. That's not possible, protested Professor Grixtal. Intuition is just incomplete analysis. You can't make consistently effective decisions without proper data processing. And yet, Dr. Fentalik observed, our human students are doing exactly that. Moreover, they're teaching our traditional students to incorporate intuitive elements into their analytical frameworks, which somehow improves overall performance. Commander Vexithorak's tail feathers were molting so rapidly that the janitorial staff had requested hazard pay for cleaning his office. So what are you suggesting? That we abandon 3,000 years of proven tactical theory in favor of, what, teaching students to guess? Not guessing, Professor Yilthara corrected. Something more like educated improvisation. The humans don't seem to make random decisions. They make decisions based on pattern recognition, contextual awareness, and what they call experience. But they process these factors much faster than our analytical methods allow. The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of Tobias himself, who wandered in carrying his usual thermos and looking slightly confused. "Oh, hello, everyone. Sorry to interrupt, but I seem to have gotten lost again. I was looking for the cafeteria, but I think I may have taken a wrong turn at the bit with all the glowing symbols. Lovely meeting room, by the way. Very formal." Commander Vexithorak's eye stalks swiveled to regard Tobias with what might have been desperation. "Mr. Crankshaw, perhaps you could help us with a question. How do you decide what to teach your students?" Tobias settled into an empty chair and opened his thermos. "Oh, that's easy. I just pay attention to what they're struggling with and try to help them figure it out, same as you'd do with anyone, really. But you don't use any established curriculum or learning objectives." "Well, no. Everyone's different, aren't they? What works for one person might not work for another, so I just sort of adapt as we go along." Professor Yilthara leaned forward with the intensity of someone discovering a new fundamental force of nature. "How do you know what will work for each student?" "I don't, really. I just try something and see what happens. If it works, great. If it doesn't, we try something else. Eventually, we find something that clicks." The faculty exchanged glances that somehow conveyed several hours' worth of philosophical discussion in the span of a few seconds. "But how do you determine whether something is working?" Dr. Fentalak asked. "Well, are they learning? Are they getting better at solving problems? Do they seem more confident about tackling new challenges? If yes, then it's probably working. If no, then we need to try a different approach." Commander Vexithorak felt something that might have been enlightenment or possibly a small brain aneurysm. "You're suggesting that educational effectiveness should be measured by student outcomes rather than methodological rigor?" "I suppose so, yeah. I mean, the whole point is to help people get better at things, right? Doesn't much matter how you do it as long as it works and doesn't harm anyone." The room fell into the kind of silence that usually precedes either great discoveries or complete institutional collapse. Finally, Instructor Quilpec raised a tentacle hesitantly. What if we've been approaching this backwards?" "How so?" Commander Vexithorak asked. "We've been trying to figure out how to make the humans' methods fit our educational framework. But what if we need to redesign our educational framework to incorporate the humans' methods?" The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about teaching, learning, and the proper way to prepare young minds for the complexities of galactic warfare. Professor Yilthara was the first to break the silence. "It would mean abandoning our current standardized curriculum structure. It would mean developing entirely new assessment methodologies," added Dr. Fentalak. "It would mean admitting that our traditional approaches, while effective, may not be optimal," concluded Professor Grixtal. Commander Vex Thorak looked around the room at his colleagues, then at Tobias, who was contentedly sipping his coffee and apparently unaware that he had just precipitated the biggest educational reform in galactic history. "Mr. Crankshaw," the commander said finally, "would you be interested in helping us redesign our entire tactical education program?" Tobias paused mid-sip. "Really? That sounds like a lot of work. I mean, I'm flattered and all, but I'm not exactly an education expert. I just help people figure things out when they get stuck." "Perhaps that's exactly what we need," Commander Vexithorak replied, his feathers settling into something resembling cautious optimism. And so began what would later be known as the Great Academic Restructuring, though Tobias himself never called it anything more dramatic than trying some new things and seeing what works. The first major change was the elimination of the Academy's rigid course structure. Instead of following predetermined sequences of tactical theory classes, students were organized into mixed groups and presented with actual problems to solve. These problems ranged from simple logistical challenges to complex multi-species diplomatic crises, and they all had one thing in common: there were no predetermined correct answers. "But how do we grade them?" asked Professor Yilthara during one of the planning sessions. "Do they solve the problem?" Tobias replied. "If yes, they pass. If no, they try again with a different approach. But what about theoretical knowledge? How do we ensure they understand the fundamental principles?" "They'll learn the principles when they need them to solve problems." Seems more likely to stick that way, doesn't it? The second major change was even more radical: the elimination of most lectures in favor of what Tobias called collaborative figuring out sessions. Instead of instructors explaining concepts to students, students worked in groups to discover concepts while instructors served as resources and guides. This approach produced some unexpected results. Students began developing hybrid solutions that combined techniques from different species, creating tactical approaches that no single species would have conceived independently. A Krelian student's methodical analysis, combined with a Killaridian student's intuitive pattern recognition and a Centauri student's systematic organization, resulted in problem-solving capabilities that exceeded what any of them could achieve alone. "It's like they're teaching each other," observed Dr. Fentalak during one of the evaluation sessions. "Well, they are," Tobias replied. "People learn better from their peers sometimes." less intimidating than learning from an expert who already knows all the answers. The Academy's testing and evaluation systems underwent similarly dramatic changes. Traditional examinations were replaced with practical assessments where students had to solve real problems under realistic conditions. Instead of demonstrating their knowledge of tactical theory, students had to demonstrate their ability to achieve tactical objectives. The results were initially chaotic. Students who had excelled at memorizing theoretical frameworks struggled when faced with problems that didn't match textbook examples. Meanwhile, students who had been considered mediocre in traditional classes suddenly distinguished themselves when given opportunities to apply creative solutions to real challenges. But perhaps the most significant change was the introduction of what Tobias called failure analysis sessions. Instead of penalizing students for unsuccessful attempts, the Academy began treating failures as learning opportunities. "Right," Tobias would announce after a particularly spectacular failed exercise. "That didn't work. Why not? What did we learn? What would we try differently next time?" Students quickly discovered that admitting mistakes and analyzing what went wrong was more valuable than pretending their failures were somehow successful. They began taking more creative risks, knowing that unsuccessful attempts would be treated as data rather than disasters. The Academy's reputation began changing in ways that made the administration simultaneously proud and nervous. Instead of being known for producing graduates who could execute established tactical procedures flawlessly, they became known for producing graduates who could develop effective solutions to problems that had never been solved before. Military organizations across the galaxy began requesting Academy graduates not for their knowledge of conventional tactics, but for their ability to handle unconventional situations. The graduates themselves seemed more confident, more adaptable, and more willing to tackle challenges that fell outside their formal training. But the most dramatic change came from an unexpected source. The students themselves began questioning everything. Why do we organize military hierarchies this way? What if the enemy doesn't follow the same tactical principles we do? Has anyone actually tested whether these traditional approaches are optimal, or do we just use them because they're traditional? The Academy found itself dealing with students who were no longer content to simply learn established procedures. They wanted to understand why those procedures existed, whether they were still relevant, and how they might be improved. Faculty meetings became philosophical discussions about the nature of knowledge, learning, and problem-solving. Instructors who had spent decades teaching established theories found themselves learning new approaches from their own students. Professor Grixtal, who had initially been the most skeptical of Tobias's methods, made perhaps the most surprising observation. "I've been teaching tactical theory for 40 years. And I've learned more about tactics in the past 6 months than in the previous decade. These students ask questions that force me to examine assumptions I didn't even realize I was making." The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some students struggled with the lack of clear guidelines and predetermined answers. Some faculty members found it difficult to adapt from being sources of information to being facilitators of discovery. And some administrators worried that the Academy was losing its institutional identity, but the results spoke for themselves. Academy graduates were achieving success rates in real-world missions that exceeded anything in the institution's recorded history. More importantly, they were reporting higher levels of job satisfaction, better relationships with their colleagues, and greater confidence in their ability to handle unexpected situations. News of the Academy's transformation spread throughout the educational networks of 12 different species. Delegations arrived from prestigious institutions across the galaxy, all wanting to observe these revolutionary teaching methods. What they found was Tobias sitting in the cafeteria, chatting with students about everything from starship engine maintenance to interspecies dating, while occasionally offering suggestions like, "Have you considered asking the maintenance crew? They usually know more about how things actually work than the people who designed them. Dr. Krextaler from the renowned Alterian Institute of Strategic Excellence spent 3 days following Tobias around, taking detailed notes on his educational methodology. At the end of his visit, he approached Tobias with barely contained academic excitement. "Mr. Crankshaw, I must know, where did you study educational theory? Your approach demonstrates sophisticated understanding of constructivist learning principles, experiential education models, and collaborative knowledge construction frameworks." Tobias paused in his contemplation of what the cafeteria optimistically called mystery meat stew. Educational theory? Never heard of it. I just pay attention to what seems to help people learn things. Dr. Krextaler's notes, which had filled 17 data tablets, suddenly seemed much less useful. The Academy's transformation reached its climax when the Galactic Education Council announced that they would be conducting their comprehensive institutional review 6 months ahead of schedule. This review would determine whether the Academy's accreditation would be renewed, modified, or revoked entirely. Commander Vex Thorak, whose stress molting had finally stabilized at manageable levels, called a final emergency meeting. "The review committee will be here in 2 weeks," he announced. "They'll be evaluating every aspect of our educational program against established galactic standards for military education, standards that we have somewhat departed from." The faculty exchanged glances that conveyed varying levels of confidence, panic, and philosophical resignation. "What if they don't approve of our changes?" asked Professor Yilthara. "Then we'll probably lose our accreditation," Commander Vex Thorak replied matter-of-factly, "and the Academy will either be closed or forced to return to traditional methods. And if they do approve, then we'll have officially proven that everything we thought we knew about education was incomplete." Tobias, who had been invited to attend this meeting despite technically not being a faculty member, raised his hand. "Question: do we think our current approach is actually working better than the old one?" "Yes," came the unanimous reply. "Are our students learning more effectively?" "Yes." "Are they better prepared for real-world challenges?" "Yes." "Are they more confident and adaptable?" "Yes." "Well then," Tobias said cheerfully, "seems like we should just show the review committee what we're doing and let them decide. If they think it's rubbish, we'll know we were wrong. If they think it's brilliant, we'll know we were right. Either way, we'll learn something useful." The review committee consisted of 12 distinguished educators representing the galaxy's most prestigious academic institutions. They arrived with detailed checklists, standardized evaluation forms, and comprehensive assessment protocols that had been refined over centuries of educational excellence. What they encountered was controlled chaos. Students were scattered throughout the Academy's facilities, working on various projects. Some were in simulation chambers, developing solutions to tactical scenarios that had no predetermined outcomes. Others were in workshops building physical models of theoretical concepts. Still others were in conference rooms, engaged in heated debates about the effectiveness of various strategic approaches. "Where are the classes?" asked Dr. Vex Nilara, the committee's chairwoman. "Everywhere," replied Commander Vexis Thorak. "Students learn when they encounter problems that require new knowledge or skills. We provide resources and guidance, but they direct their own learning based on what they need to solve the challenges they're facing. But how do you ensure coverage of essential curriculum elements?" "We don't, exactly. We ensure that students can solve problems effectively. If they need specific knowledge to solve those problems, they acquire it. If they can solve problems without that knowledge, then perhaps it wasn't as essential as we thought." The committee spent 3 days observing classes that weren't classes, evaluating curricula that didn't exist in traditional formats, and trying to assess learning outcomes using metrics that seemed increasingly irrelevant. Their breaking point came when they observed a group of first-year students successfully resolving a complex diplomatic crisis that had been included in the assessment as an example of an impossible scenario, something designed to demonstrate the limits of student capabilities. The students had solved it by ignoring traditional diplomatic protocols and instead focusing on identifying what each party actually needed rather than what they claimed they wanted. Their solution was so elegant and effective that the committee's diplomatic advisor suggested it be forwarded to the real diplomatic corps as a potential model for actual crisis resolution. "This shouldn't be possible," Dr. Vexnilara muttered as she reviewed her notes. "First-year students don't have sufficient theoretical background to handle this level of complexity." "Maybe theoretical background isn't what they actually need," suggested Professor Yilthara. "Maybe they just need practice solving problems and the confidence to trust their judgment." The committee's final evaluation session lasted 14 hours. At the end, they produced a report that no one had expected, and everyone found somehow inevitable. The Academy's accreditation was not only renewed, but upgraded to exemplary innovation status, a designation that had never been awarded before and required the creation of an entirely new category of institutional recognition. More significantly, the Galactic Education Council recommended that other institutions study the Academy's approaches and consider implementing similar methodologies. "The Academy has demonstrated," the report concluded, "that effective education may require less emphasis on information transmission and greater emphasis on capability development. Their students consistently demonstrate superior problem-solving abilities, higher levels of adaptability, and more effective collaborative skills than graduates from traditional programs." The report's final paragraph became legendary in educational circles. While the Academy's methods defy conventional pedagogical theory, their results suggest that conventional pedagogical theory may be incomplete. "We recommend further study of these approaches and careful consideration of their applicability to other educational contexts." Tobias read the report while sitting in his favorite spot in the cafeteria, occasionally chuckling and shaking his head. "Funny thing about experts," he commented to Slixnara, who had become something of an unofficial teaching assistant. "They always want to understand why something works before they're willing to admit that it works. Me, I'm happy just knowing that it works. The why is interesting, but it's not necessary for the doing." "So, what happens now?" Slixnara asked. "Now? Well, I suppose we keep doing what we've been doing. Helping people figure things out, trying new approaches when the old ones don't work, and trusting that most problems have solutions if you're creative enough to find them." He paused to take a sip of his coffee, which had somehow evolved from mysterious purple liquid to something that actually resembled coffee, though it still tasted faintly of quantum mechanics. "Although I have to admit," he continued, "it's been quite an adventure. When I first got that invitation to visit a fancy space academy, I figured I'd spend a week looking at impressive alien technology and maybe learn something interesting about interstellar military tactics. I never expected to accidentally revolutionize galactic education. Do you think you really revolutionized it?" Tobias considered the question while watching a group of students from 6 different species work together to solve a logistics problem that would have stumped professional planners just a few months earlier. "I don't think I revolutionized anything," he said finally. "I think I just reminded everyone that learning is supposed to be about getting better at things, not about memorizing what other people already figured out. The revolution was already there. People just needed permission to let it happen." The Academy continued to evolve. New approaches were tested, some successful and others less so. Students and faculty continued learning from each other. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Tobias continued wandering around, offering suggestions, asking questions, and occasionally getting lost while looking for the bathroom. But perhaps the most significant change was one that couldn't be measured in performance metrics or academic assessments. The academy had become a place where people enjoyed learning. Students were excited about tackling new challenges. Faculty members looked forward to discovering what their students would come up with next, and everyone seemed to understand that the best solutions often came from the most unexpected places. Word of the Academy's success spread far beyond academic circles. Military organizations, corporate training programs, and even governmental agencies began requesting consultation on how to implement similar approaches in their own contexts. Tobias found himself in the bizarre position of being considered an expert on educational methodology, despite having never studied educational methodology. He was invited to speak at conferences, contribute to academic journals, and advise institutions throughout the galaxy. His standard response was always the same: "I don't know anything about educational theory. I just pay attention to what helps people learn things and try to do more of that." This response, which should have disqualified him from expert status, somehow seemed to enhance his credibility. People began to realize that perhaps the most important qualification for understanding learning was actually caring about whether learning happened. The Academy's influence began reshaping military education throughout the galaxy. Traditional drill and memorization approaches gave way to problem-based learning. Rigid hierarchical instruction models were supplemented with peer collaboration systems. And most importantly, the question, "Does this help people become more effective?" began taking precedence over, "Is this how we've always done it?" But the changes weren't limited to military education. The Academy's approaches proved remarkably adaptable to other fields. Medical schools discovered that students who learned diagnostic skills by solving real cases rather than memorizing symptom lists became more effective doctors. Engineering programs found that students who learned design principles by building actual solutions rather than studying theoretical models became more innovative engineers. The galaxy was experiencing what historians would later call the Great Educational Awakening, though most of the people involved simply thought of it as, "Finally, learning that makes sense." Tobias watched these developments with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. He had become, quite accidentally, one of the most influential educators in galactic history. His casual suggestions had reshaped how entire civilizations thought about learning, knowledge, and problem-solving. "It's all gotten a bit out of hand, hasn't it?" he commented to Commander Vexithorak during one of their regular coffee meetings. "In the best possible way," the commander replied. His stress molting had been replaced by what could only be described as enthusiastic molting, apparently a sign of intellectual excitement among his species. "Do you ever miss the old way of doing things?" Tobias asked. Commander Vexithorak considered the question while watching a group of students enthusiastically debate whether quantum mechanics or classical physics provided a better framework for understanding interstellar logistics. "I miss the certainty," he said finally. "It was comfortable knowing exactly what we were supposed to teach and how we were supposed to teach it. But I don't miss the limitations. Our old methods produced competent graduates who could execute established procedures effectively. Our new methods produce creative graduates who can develop new procedures when established ones aren't sufficient. And which do you think the galaxy needs more? Given that the universe seems determined to present us with problems that no one has solved before, definitely the creative ones." As the Academy's reputation continued to grow, so did the number of human requests for admission. Earth's educational authorities had initially been puzzled by the sudden interest in their planet's inhabitants, but they quickly began sending their most promising candidates to participate in what they understood to be an advanced interstellar education program. Each new human arrival brought different perspectives and approaches, adding to the Academy's growing collection of unconventional problem-solving methods. There was Maria, a former crisis counselor who taught students how to identify what people actually needed rather than what they said they wanted. There was Chen, a mechanical engineer who demonstrated that most complex systems could be understood by figuring out what each component was trying to accomplish. And there was Robert, a former elementary school teacher who showed everyone that the most sophisticated concepts could be explained using simple analogies and practical examples. But perhaps the most significant arrival was Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, a cognitive psychologist who had spent her career studying how people actually learned as opposed to how educational theory said they should learn. "This is fascinating," she announced after her first week at the academy. "You've accidentally created the most effective learning environment I've ever observed, and you did it by ignoring every principle of instructional design that we consider fundamental." "Is that good or bad?" asked Tobias. "It's revolutionary. You're providing immediate feedback, authentic assessment, collaborative learning opportunities, intrinsic motivation, and adaptive instruction, all without trying to provide any of those things. You're just helping people solve problems they care about solving." Dr. Vasquez became the Academy's unofficial researcher, documenting what was happening and why it seemed to work so well. Her findings challenged fundamental assumptions about learning, motivation, and human cognitive development. Traditional education assumes that knowledge must be transmitted from experts to novices through structured curricula, she explained during one of her presentations to the faculty. But what we're seeing here suggests that knowledge is more effectively constructed through guided problem-solving experiences. Students don't just learn facts and procedures. They develop understanding, judgment, and confidence. Her research attracted attention from cognitive scientists throughout the galaxy, leading to collaborative studies on learning processes across different species. The results suggested that most intelligent species shared certain fundamental learning patterns that were poorly served by traditional educational approaches. The Academy had become more than an educational institution. It had become a research center for understanding how minds actually worked when they were learning effectively. But all of this academic recognition and theoretical validation might have remained merely interesting if not for what happened next: the Krellian crisis. The crisis began when the Krellian Empire's most advanced military academy, the institution that had trained their greatest strategic minds for over a millennium, suddenly found itself unable to solve a relatively simple tactical problem. A group of pirates had established a base in an asteroid field and were disrupting shipping lanes throughout a major trade region. The pirates were using unconventional tactics, hit-and-run strikes, and adaptive strategies that seemed to anticipate every move the Krellian military made against them. Traditional Krellian tactical doctrine called for systematic analysis of enemy capabilities, development of comprehensive response strategies, and implementation of overwhelming force protocols. But every time they implemented these approaches, the pirates simply changed their methods, rendering the Krellian strategies ineffective. After 6 months of unsuccessful attempts, the Krellian military reluctantly requested assistance from other galactic powers. Unfortunately, every military organization they contacted relied on similar analytical approaches and produced equally ineffective results. Finally, in desperation, they contacted the Academy. "We need your most advanced tactical graduates," the Krellian admiral explained during the emergency conference call. "Our traditional methods are proving insufficient against an enemy that refuses to behave predictably." Commander Vexithorak assured the admiral that they would send their best people, then immediately panicked about who exactly that might be. The Academy's graduates were certainly creative and adaptable, but they had never been tested against a real enemy using actual weapons in an actual crisis situation. "What do you think?" he asked Tobias. "Can our students handle something like this?" "Only one way to find out," Tobias replied, "but I suspect they'll do better than anyone expects. They're used to dealing with problems that don't have predetermined solutions." The Academy assembled a response team consisting of 6 recent graduates representing 4 different species, led by Slixnara and including 2 humans who had joined the program during its experimental phase. What happened next became legendary throughout galactic military circles. Instead of developing complex analytical strategies, the team spent their first day talking to merchant ship crews, asteroid miners, and local traders, anyone who had encountered the pirates or worked in the affected region. Instead of studying the pirates' previous attack patterns, they focused on understanding what the pirates were trying to accomplish and why conventional military responses hadn't been effective. Instead of developing overwhelming force protocols, they created what they called adaptive response frameworks, flexible approaches that could be modified in real time based on whatever the pirates did next. Their solution was elegant in its simplicity. They offered the pirates something better than piracy. Through their conversations with local traders, they had learned that the pirates were primarily motivated by economic necessity rather than criminal intent. The asteroid field contained valuable minerals, but the mining rights were controlled by a corporate monopoly that provided minimal compensation to local workers. The Academy team negotiated a new arrangement where the former pirates became legitimate security contractors, protecting mining operations in exchange for fair compensation and profit-sharing agreements. The corporate monopoly initially resisted, but quickly agreed when they realized that legitimate security was more effective and less expensive than constant battles with pirates. The entire crisis was resolved in 3 weeks without firing a single shot. The Krellian military was so impressed that they immediately requested permission to send observers to study at the Academy. Within months, military organizations throughout the galaxy were implementing Academy-inspired training programs. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the realization that the Academy's graduates weren't just better at solving tactical problems, they were better at solving problems in general. Their training in creative thinking, collaborative analysis, and adaptive problem-solving proved applicable to challenges far beyond military scenarios. Academy graduates began appearing in diplomatic corps, corporate management programs, scientific research teams, and social service organizations. Wherever they went, they brought the same approach: focus on understanding the real problem, consider unconventional solutions, collaborate with anyone who might have useful perspectives, and adapt when initial approaches don't work. The Academy's influence was reshaping not just how people learned, but how they thought about problems, solutions, and the nature of expertise itself. Tobias found himself reflecting on these developments during what had become his regular evening walk around the Academy's grounds. The facilities looked much the same as when he had first arrived, but everything else had changed in ways he was still trying to understand. Students from dozens of species worked together on projects that would have been impossible under the old system. Faculty members collaborated across disciplines that had previously been strictly separated. And throughout the complex, there was a sense of excitement and discovery that seemed to energize everyone involved. "Quite a journey from that first tactical simulation, isn't it?" observed Slixnara, who had joined him for the walk. "I'm still not entirely sure what happened," Tobias admitted. "I came here thinking I was going to learn about advanced alien military tactics. Instead, I seem to have accidentally started some kind of educational revolution." "Do you think it was really an accident?" Tobias considered the question as they walked past a group of late-night students, engaged in what appeared to be a friendly argument about optimal resource allocation strategies. "I think the revolution was already waiting to happen," he said finally. "People were ready for approaches that made sense, that respected their intelligence, and that actually helped them become more capable. I just happened to arrive at the right time, with the right attitude, which was that learning should be about getting better at things you care about, not about proving you can memorize things other people already figured out." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, watching the Academy's 3 artificial moons drift slowly through their synchronized orbits. "So, what happens next?" Slick's Nara asked. Tobias smiled, an expression that had become familiar to students and faculty throughout the Academy, the smile of someone who genuinely enjoyed not knowing what was going to happen next. "Next, we keep learning, keep trying new things, and keep trusting that people are generally pretty good at figuring things out when you give them the chance." He paused to wave at a group of maintenance droids who had learned to recognize him during his frequent wandering sessions. "But I'll tell you one thing. I never expected that accepting an invitation to visit a fancy space school would turn out to be the most interesting mistake I ever made." As they returned to the main complex, neither of them noticed the small inscription that had recently appeared on the Academy's memorial wall, placed there by unanimous vote of the student body. "In recognition of the human who taught us that the best way to solve impossible problems is to ignore the impossibility and focus on the solution." The inscription was unsigned, but everyone knew who had inspired it. And somewhere in the Academy's cafeteria, a thermos of coffee sat waiting for tomorrow's discoveries, whatever they might turn out to be. Because in a universe full of impossible problems and unexpected solutions, the only certainty was that there would always